My son smirked as I faced total exclusion from a $34 fortune, but one sentence from the lawyer shattered his ego and changed my life. This cinematic tale of betrayal proves that justice has an address, and it isn't where you'd expect. Before continuing, write where you are from or what time it is. The coffee cup shattered against the linoleum, a jagged splash of dark caffeine and ceramic shards spreading toward my boots. My pulse spikes as Mrs. Henderson's voice hammers through the thin apartment wall, accusing me of flooding her begonias for the third time this week. I do not look back at the mess. I move toward the kitchen chair. I am 65 years old, a retired power plant worker with calloused hands, and a bank account that barely clears $500 after the rent check clears. I grabbed a dish towel, kneeling among the sharp edges, scrubbing at a life that feels as stained as this floor. My automatic sprinkler system had a loose joint, sending water cascading over the property line, but patience was never Eleanor's strong suit. The phone rang, a shrill intrusion cutting through the muffled shouting from next door. I ignored it, focused on the spreading puddle, but the ringing persisted, sharp and demanding. On the fifth ring, I stood up, tossing the soaked towel into the sink and grabbing the receiver. Jerry Flores speaking. Mr. Flores, this is Janet Morrison from Morrison Welsh and Associates in Cheyenne. The woman's voice carried that careful, professional chill I had learned to recognize over the years, the kind that preceded a heavy blow. My hand tightened around the plastic. I am calling regarding Brianna Elizabeth Flores. Nobody had called Brianna by her full name in my presence for 15 years. I felt the air go thinner than oxygen. What about her? Sir, I am very sorry to inform you that Mrs. Flores passed away on Tuesday evening. The words hit like a physical punch to the solar plexus. I sank into the wooden chair, its familiar creak sounding like a gunshot in the sudden silence of my kitchen. Tuesday evening. That was 3 days ago. 3 days while I had been worrying about sprinkler schedules and coffee stains. Mr. Flores, are you there? Yes, I managed, my voice sounding like it belonged to a ghost. How did you get my number? Your name was listed in Mrs. Flores's personal effects as an emergency contact. I understand you were previously married. Previously married. 22 years of life, a son, a mortgage, and 1,000 shared meals reduced to a legal footnote in a stranger's file. Yes, I said, the words coming from muscle memory. We divorced in 2010. I see, the lawyer replied. Well, there will be a reading of the will following the service this Friday at 2 at Riverside Memorial Chapel. You are named as a beneficiary, so your presence would be appreciated. Beneficiary. The word felt foreign, a jagged piece of a puzzle that didn't fit. Brianna had built a $34 million empire after we split, transforming a small consulting business into a corporate titan. I barely recognized her from the newspaper articles. What could she possibly have left me? Through the kitchen window, I saw Eleanor Henderson examining her waterlogged plants, hands on her hips, a new confrontation brewing. But her complaints belonged to a dead world now. Riverside Memorial on Grand Avenue, I said slowly. I will be there. I hung up and stared at the dark rings of coffee setting into the floor, unable to process that Brianna, the woman who once promised me forever, was truly gone. Riverside Memorial sat on a hill overlooking Rock Springs, a Gothic fortress of mahogany and stained glass. I parked my 15-year-old Honda between a Lexus and a Cadillac, feeling like a smudge on a polished mirror. The interior whispered of money, filled with 200 people in suits that cost more than my car. I recognized faces from the business dinners Brianna used to drag me to, back when she still looked at me with pride instead of pity. I slipped into a back pew, hoping to remain invisible, but the whispers followed me like a cold draft. A woman in an expensive black suit pointed discreetly, her voice carrying fragments of a narrative where I was the villain, the anchor that nearly drowned a brilliant woman's ambition. I forced my jaw to lock. I wasn't here for them. Then, a voice cut through the murmur like a blade. Dad. I looked up to see Dustin striding down the aisle, his face a mask of disbelief and barely controlled fury. At 37, He had inherited Brianna's sharp features and a suit that cost $5,000. Success radiated from him, along with a cologne that smelled like aggression. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice carrying across the chapel and silencing the room. I stood slowly, meeting his gaze. "I came to pay my respects." "You lost the right to do that 15 years ago," he spat. He moved closer, his eyes narrowing. "She wouldn't want you here." "Maybe not," I said, "but I needed to be here." "For what? To play the grieving widower for people who know exactly what kind of husband you were?" The chapel went silent, 200 pairs of eyes focusing on us. Dustin turned to the crowd, his voice rising with practiced authority. "This is Jerry Flores, the man who spent 22 years holding back one of the most brilliant women this town ever produced. While she built an empire, he was content to punch a time clock." "Dustin, that is enough," I said. The words harder than I intended. He didn't stop. "He took half her assets in the divorce despite contributing nothing," he shouted, a prosecutor addressing a jury. "He spent 15 years acting like the victim while she built something magnificent. My mother died building something that will outlast us all, and she deserved a husband who helped her reach those heights, not one who tried to drag her down to his level." He stood there, waiting for me to crumble, to slink away in shame before the elite of the city. But I remained standing, the weight of his judgment heavy but familiar. "I loved your mother for 40 years, I said, my voice carrying through the silence. 22 as her husband, 18 wishing her well. I am not here to demand recognition. I am here to honor a promise." I sat back down, folding my hands. Dustin stood frozen, his face twisting with a final flash of contempt before he turned toward the front pew. The service was a blur of eulogies painting Brianna as a visionary who overcame every obstacle. When it ended, people filed past, offering condolences to Dustin while pointedly ignoring the man in the back. I waited until the chapel emptied, ready to disappear, when a man in a sharp suit approached. "Dan Morrison," he said, his grip firm. "I need a word with you and Dustin. We need to discuss the estate." Dustin appeared at my shoulder, his expression shifting to alert interest. "Dan," finally he said, "let's handle the business side." Dan's eyes moved between us, professional and unreadable. "I'd like you both to come to my office for the reading of your mother's will." "Both of us?" Dustin's eyebrows rose. "Is that necessary?" "Your father is specifically named in the will, Dustin," Dan replied. "His presence is required by law." I felt a flutter of surprise in my chest. "Named in the will?" I followed them out of the chapel, the afternoon light slanting gray and cold over the valley, wondering what final message Brianna had buried in the legal ink. Dan Morrison's office was a shrine to established success, all dark wood and leather-bound books. Certificates lined the walls, interrupted by photographs of the lawyer with dignitaries. It was exactly the kind of place Brianna loved. Dustin claimed the chair closest to the desk with a satisfied smile, leaving me the one slightly to the side. Dan settled behind his mahogany desk and opened a thick file extracting pages bound with a blue backing. The afternoon light illuminated dust motes dancing in the suddenly quiet room. "This is the last will and testament of Brianna Elizabeth Flores," Dan began, his voice carrying the formal cadence of a ritual. "Executed on March 15, 2024, only 14 months ago." I wondered what had prompted her to update it so recently. Had she known the end was coming? The room felt heavy with the tick of an antique clock on the shelf. "I hereby make the following specific bequests," Dan read. "To my son, Dustin Michael Flores, I leave the family home at 847 Hillcrest Avenue, along with all furnishings and personal property." Dustin's smile widened. The Hillcrest house was worth $800,000, a fortress of glass and stone with mountain views. Additionally, Dan continued, "I bequeath to Dustin the sum of $500,000 to be transferred within 60 days of probate, $500,000. I watched Dustin, noting how his smile flickered. He was pleased, but I could see him calculating. 500,000 was significant, but Brianna's empire was worth 34 million. Where was the rest of it? Where was the company? That is wonderful, of course, Dustin said, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty. But what about the business interests? Dan set down the first page and lifted the second, his expression remaining neutral. I am continuing with the bequest, Dustin. Please allow me to finish. The bequest to Dustin includes the following conditions. The inheritance is contingent upon his continued employment with Flores Consulting Solutions for a minimum of 2 years, or until such time as the company is sold or dissolved. Dustin looked genuinely confused. Conditions? And what do you mean until the company is sold? Who would sell it? I'm reading the will as written, Dan replied. These are your mother's words. Tension I hadn't noticed before began to crawl up the walls. Dustin's hands unclenched and reclenched in his lap. I found myself leaning forward, the air in the room feeling thick and charged with something I couldn't name. Your mother's will contains additional provisions that address the remaining assets, Dan said quietly. The company, the investment portfolio, and several other holdings. Well, then let's hear them, Dustin demanded, his patience wearing thin. I watched the exchange with growing unease. Something about Dan's manner suggested we were approaching territory none of us were prepared for. He was parsing his words carefully, the way a doctor speaks when delivering a difficult diagnosis. Before I continue, I want to emphasize that these documents represent Mrs. Flores's final wishes. She was adamant about their contents. The room fell into a profound silence, the kind that happens just before a storm breaks. Dan lifted the third page, his eyes scanning the text before looking directly at me for the first time. To my former husband, Jerry Michael Flores, he read, his words falling like stones into a still pond. I bequeath the sum of $33.5 million to be transferred from my primary investment accounts and securities portfolio. The number hung in the air like smoke. 33.5 million. I felt my mouth fall open. It didn't seem real. It didn't belong in a universe where I worried about the cost of a new alternator for my car. There must be some mistake, I managed to say, my voice sounding distant. Did you say 33 million? Yes, Dan said, his gaze steady, not surprised but observing the chaos. Dustin's face went white, then a furious red, the blood rushing to his head so fast I thought he might collapse. What did you just say? Dustin whispered, his voice trembling. Additionally, Dan continued, I transfer to Jerry Flores controlling interest in Flores Consulting Solutions, including all subsidiary companies and business assets. This transfer includes 65% ownership and an appointment as chairman of the board. I couldn't breathe. The room seemed to tilt. Controlling interest in the empire I had watched her build from nothing, the business that had consumed our marriage and made me feel inadequate for 2 decades. She was giving it all to me. This can't be right, I said weakly. There has to be an error. I assure you, Mr. Flores, there is no error, Dan replied, cleaning his glasses with methodical precision. She reviewed every word multiple times. Dustin shot to his feet so abruptly his chair hit the wall. This is impossible, he screamed. She wouldn't. She couldn't. He turned to me, his eyes wild with a mixture of disbelief and pure, unadulterated hatred. What did you do? How did you manipulate her? I didn't do anything, I said, still trying to grasp the magnitude of the number. I haven't spoken to her in 15 years. Liar, he exploded. People don't just give away $33 million to an ex-husband for no reason. You must have gotten to her when she was sick. Dan's voice cut through the rising hysteria. I can assure you that Mrs. Flores was of sound mind. She underwent a mental competency evaluation specifically to prevent any challenges to this will. I sat frozen, watching my son unravel. The numbers Dan had read belonged to a different world, a world of power and influence I had never wanted. But why? I asked, the question emerging from a deep place of confusion. Why would she do this? Dan gathered the documents into a neat stack. Mrs. Flores left specific instructions regarding that question, he said. She asked me to share a personal message with you after reading these provisions. Dustin's face contorted with rage. A personal message? She left him a message but cut me out of everything that mattered. You received a substantial inheritance, Dustin, Dan replied. $500,000 in a property worth nearly $1 million is more than most see in a lifetime. Compared to what he is getting, Dustin pointed a shaking finger at me. You're talking about the entire empire. The room pulsed with a tension so thick I could taste the copper of it. My entire life had just changed in a way I couldn't comprehend. All I could focus on was the impossible fact that Brianna, the woman who had grown to resent everything I represented, had decided to hand me the keys to her kingdom. Dustin completely lost control, slamming his palm against the desk and sending papers scattering across the floor. "This is fraud!" he shrieked. "Criminal fraud! She was coerced!" He whirled toward me, his face twisted into something unrecognizable. "You did something to her. There is no other explanation." I shrank back, overwhelmed by the violence of his reaction. "Dustin, I swear I had no contact with her. I didn't even know she was ill." "Liar," he hissed. "Nobody gives everything to the man who abandoned their family." "She didn't abandon anyone," I said, finding a small reserve of strength. "Our marriage ended, but that doesn't mean—" "It means exactly that." Dustin's voice rose to a near shriek. "You walked away. You took your pathetic settlement and disappeared into your pathetic life while she built an empire. And now you want me to believe she just handed it to you?" Dan's voice cut through the chaos again. "Dustin, I must insist you control yourself. These are your mother's wishes." Dustin spun toward the lawyer. "I want every document examined. I want to know every contact this man had with her in the last 5 years." "There were no contacts," Dan replied calmly. "She made that clear when she explained her decision." "Explained?" Dustin's laugh was bitter. "So she explained why she betrayed her son?" "She left a personal message for your father," Dan said. The word father hit Dustin like a physical blow. For a second, his rage flickered, and I saw a pain so deep it made my chest ache. Then the fury returned, doubled in intensity. "He is not my father," Dustin snarled, the words dripping with years of accumulated resentment. "My father would have been there when she needed him. My father would have supported her dreams instead of trying to drag her down to his level." He turned back to me, his face a mask of contempt. "You're nothing but a failed man who couldn't handle being married to someone better than you." Each word landed like a knife. I had felt inadequate. I had struggled with her success. "Maybe you're right," I said quietly. "Maybe I wasn't the husband she deserved. But I never asked for this." "Expected?" Dustin's voice climbed another octave. "You orchestrated this. You got to her when she was vulnerable." "That is enough," Dan interrupted, his professional patience finally showing strain. "Mrs. Flores was neither sick nor vulnerable. She was more clear-minded than I had ever seen her." "Then why?" Dustin demanded, his voice breaking. "Why would she do this to me? I was everything she wanted. I worked for her company. I lived the life she planned. I became the son she could be proud of." The pain in his voice cut through my shock. I saw him clearly. A man who had spent his life trying to earn approval, only to find the ultimate validation had been given to the man he despised. "She left a message explaining her reasoning," Dan said. "Would you like to hear it?" Dustin's hands were shaking as he slumped back into the leather chair, his rage displaced by a desperate, hollow curiosity. I remained frozen, afraid to hope for an answer, but needing one to survive the weight of the moment. Dan reached for an envelope with Brianna's distinctive, elegant handwriting across the front. "Enough, both of you," he said, commanding the room. "Before this goes any further, I have something that will explain everything." He extracted several pages of cream-colored stationery. Brianna knew this would be difficult. She asked me to read this. I felt my heart hammer against my ribs. Dan cleared his throat and began to read the words of a woman who had been a ghost in my life for 15 years. "My dearest Jerry," Dan began, and the sound of my name in her prose made the room feel like it was vibrating. "If you are hearing this, it means I am gone, and you are probably sitting in Dan's office wondering if the world has lost its mind. I can picture your face, that expression you used to get when I'd rearrange the furniture without warning, confused but trying to be polite about it." I felt the ghost of a smile pull at my lips. She had captured it perfectly. "I know this inheritance comes as a shock. I know you think there has been a mistake, that you don't deserve this. No, you are wrong. You deserve every penny, and I am going to tell you why." Dan paused, glancing at us before continuing. "I never stopped loving you. Not during our worst fights, not during the divorce, not during these 15 years of stubborn silence. I was angry with you for not understanding my ambitions," the letter continued. "But I was angrier with myself for choosing those ambitions over our marriage. You tried to save us, Jerry. You begged me to find balance, to remember what mattered. I was too proud and too afraid to listen. The words hit me like physical blows. Tears started hot and unexpected as decades of guilt began to dissolve. 'Dustin,' the message said, and my son's head snapped up. 'My beautiful, brilliant boy. I know you are furious. You think your father manipulated me. But sweetheart, you are not ready for this inheritance. Not yet.' Dustin's face went white. 'You have lived your entire life in the shadow of my success, accepting the benefits without understanding the responsibility. You have never built something from nothing. More importantly,' she wrote, 'you have spent 15 years hating a good man for crimes he never committed.' 'That's not true,' Dustin whispered, but the conviction was gone from his voice. 'Jerry taught me about character, about integrity, about the strength that doesn't need to prove itself through cruelty. I forgot those lessons when I chose money over love. But I never forgot the man who taught them to me.' I was crying openly now." Brianna's words were rebuilding a foundation I thought was gone forever, the sense that my quiet life of service had value. "Dustin, you have received enough to live comfortably and explore who you might become without the weight of unlimited wealth. Learn to value people over profit. Learn to forgive your father for being human." Dustin made a sound like a wounded animal, a low moan of realization or agony. "Jerry, you are inheriting more than money. You are inheriting the chance to do what I should have done, to use wealth as a tool for good rather than a weapon. I trust you because you never wanted this, because you will never use it to hurt people the way I sometimes did." The letter continued for several paragraphs, outlining practical matters and her hopes for our futures. But the core was absolute. Brianna had chosen character over entitlement. When Dan finished, the office fell into a silence so profound I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I sat with tears on my cheeks, overwhelmed by the gift of knowing she had loved me until the end. Dustin stared at the floor, his world crumbling. Dan folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. "She asked me to give this to you, Jerry. It is yours to keep." I reached for it with trembling hands, holding the last conversation I would ever have with the woman who shaped my soul. The weight of her words settled over the room, like dust after an explosion. For several minutes, nobody spoke. I held the letter to my chest, feeling the physical reality of her final gift. It wasn't just $33 million, it was the restoration of my worth. Dustin was the first to break the silence. "This isn't over," he said, "but the fire was out. I can contest this. Mental incapacity. Fraud. There are ways to challenge a will." I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw a man who had spent his life expecting the world to bend, who never learned that love cannot be inherited. "You could try," I said gently. "But your mother was right, Dustin. You aren't ready for this responsibility." "And you are?" He let out a bitter, hollow laugh. "You're a nobody dad, a retired power plant worker with no business experience and no connections." For a second, the old Jerry wanted to agree, but her voice echoed in my head. "You deserve every penny." "Maybe you're right," I said, standing up. "Maybe I don't know about running an empire, but I know something your mother valued more than expertise. I know the difference between serving others and serving myself." Dustin's face twisted with a final flash of rage. "This is insane. She was sick. She wasn't thinking." Dan's voice cut through with finality. "Your mother was 62 and in perfect health. She underwent psychological evaluations specifically to prevent these challenges." "Then why?" Dustin's voice cracked. "Why would she do this to me? I felt a surge of unexpected compassion for him. She didn't do it to you, Dustin. She did it for you. She gave you a chance to discover who you are without the shadow of wealth. I don't want that chance. The words exploded from him. I want what is rightfully mine. What is rightfully yours, I said, is $500,000 in a house. That is more than most see in a lifetime. What you think you deserved was never yours to begin with. Dustin stared at me, and I saw him realize that the man he had humiliated that morning was no longer asking for his approval. You think you've won, he said, grabbing his coat. You think this makes you a hero? No, I replied, and I felt the truth of it in my bones. I think it makes me responsible. He stood at the door for a moment, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. This isn't finished. Yes, it is, I said. This finished the moment she made her choice. The only question is what you do with the life she gave you. He left without another word, the door closing with a soft click. Dan began organizing his papers. There will be paperwork, accounts to transfer, board meetings. The management team is excellent. They will help you transition. I nodded, my mind still reeling. Dan, I asked, did she really love me? Even after everything? He smiled, the first genuine look I'd seen from him. Jerry, she talked about you every time we met. Not about the divorce or the problems. She talked about the man who taught her that success without character is just an expensive failure. I walked out of that office a different man. The afternoon sun felt warmer, the air cleaner. I had work to do, a company to learn about, and lives to improve. For the first time in 15 years, I felt worthy of the challenge. Justice wasn't about revenge. It was about recognition. Character mattered more than credentials, and love, real love, never truly died. Brianna had seen that, and she had given me the chance to prove her right. The transition from a two-bedroom apartment to the chairman's suite of a $34 million empire didn't happen in a day, but the weight of it landed the moment I stepped into the Florist Consulting headquarters. The lobby was a cathedral of glass and steel, polished to a shine that made my thrift store shoes look like an insult. The receptionist, a young woman with a headset and a gaze that could freeze water, didn't recognize me. "May I help you, sir?" I looked at the digital directory where Brianna's name still sat at the top. "I'm Jerry Flores," I said. Her eyes widened, the professional mask slipping for a heartbeat. "Oh, of course, Mr. Flores. Mr. Morrison is expecting you in the boardroom." I walked toward the elevators, my reflection in the chrome doors showing a man who looked like he was heading to a funeral, not a takeover. The boardroom was filled with 12 people in charcoal suits, the management team Brianna had spent a decade handpicking. They were sharp, efficient, and currently looking at me as if I were a glitch in their software. Dan Morrison stood at the head of the table. "Everyone, this is Jerry Flores." The silence that followed was heavy with skepticism. I took the seat at the head of the table, Brianna's seat. The leather was cold. One man, the CFO, a fellow named Marcus with a silver tie and a gaze like a ledger, cleared his throat. "Mr. Flores, we've prepared a briefing on the current acquisitions." I raised a hand. "Not yet, Marcus. First, I want to see the employee pension records and the community outreach budget." A flicker of confusion went around the table. They expected me to ask about profit margins. I wanted to see the heart of the machine. For the next 3 weeks, I lived in that office, fueled by black coffee and the memory of Brianna's letter. I wasn't a businessman, but I knew about systems. I knew that if the foundation is weak, the whole structure collapses when the wind blows. I found that Brianna had been aggressive, sometimes to a fault. She had cut corners on employee benefits to fuel expansion. I began reversing those calls, shifting funds back into the people who did the work. The board grumbled, whispering about retired mentalities, but they couldn't stop me. I owned 65% of the vote. I was using her wealth as a tool, just as she'd asked. But every evening when the glass towers went dark, I'd sit in her chair and look at the photograph on her desk. It was a picture of us years ago at the diner. She was laughing. The first major challenge came on a Tuesday. Dustin didn't show up for work. As part of the will's conditions, he had to maintain his employment, but his office remained empty. I called him, but it went straight to voicemail. I knew what he was doing. He was waiting for me to fail, or he was talking to lawyers. By Wednesday, a process server arrived at my office. Dustin was contesting the will. The claim was exactly what Dan had predicted: undue influence and mental incapacity. He was coming for the $33 million, and he was coming for the company. I felt a pang of grief, not for the money, but for the son I had lost to the green-eyed monster of greed. I called Dan. "How bad is it?" "Not bad," he said. "We have the psych evaluations, but it will be public. It will be ugly." I decided to meet him, not through lawyers, but as his father. I went to the Hillcrest house, the one Brianna had left him. It was a masterpiece of architecture, but it felt hollow. Dustin opened the door, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. "What do you want, Chairman?" I stepped inside, the foyer echoing with the sound of my boots. "Drop the suit, Dustin. You have enough to live 10 lifetimes. Why do this?" "Because it should have been mine," he shouted, the echoes bouncing off the high ceilings. "You're a caretaker, Dad. You don't belong in that office. You're spending my inheritance on pension funds and charity." I looked at him, seeing the bitterness etched into his face. "It was never your inheritance," I said quietly. "It was her legacy, and you're proving every day why she didn't trust you with it." He laughed, a sharp, jagged sound. "We'll see what the judge says about a man who hasn't spoken to his wife in 15 years suddenly becoming a multimillionaire. I'm going to strip you of every cent, and then I'm going to sell that company to the highest bidder. I'll burn it down just to see you back in that apartment." I realized then that the greed had gone deeper than I thought. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the shame of being passed over. He needed to win to prove he wasn't the failure his mother's will suggested he was. I walked to the door. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Dustin, but I won't let you destroy what she built." As I drove away, I saw him standing in the massive window of the Hillcrest house, a lonely silhouette against the mountain sunset. The legal battle began to pick up speed. The local papers caught wind of the power plant millionaire and the disinherited son. Every morning, I had to walk through a gauntlet of cameras to get to the office. The board of directors was getting nervous. The stock was dipping. Marcus, the CFO, walked into my office on a Friday afternoon. "Mr. Flores, the investors are worried. Dustin is making a lot of noise about your lack of experience. He's suggesting you're mismanaging the funds by redirecting them to nonprofit sectors." I looked at him steady. "Are we profitable, Marcus? Yes, but..." "Then we're fine." But we weren't fine. Dustin had found an ally. One of the minority shareholders, a man who had always wanted Brianna's chair, was feeding Dustin information. I spent my night studying the corporate bylaws, looking for a way to protect the company from a hostile takeover if the court case went sideways. I was learning the language of the enemy, the cold tactical maneuvers of the business world. But I kept the heart. I visited the power plant where I used to work, setting up a scholarship fund for the children of the workers. I saw my old friends, men with grease under their fingernails and honest eyes. They looked at me with a mix of awe and respect. "You're doing good, Jerry," my old foreman said. "Don't let the suits change you." I promised him I wouldn't. But the pressure was mounting. Dustin's lawyers had filed a motion to freeze the accounts. If they succeeded, the company would grind to a halt. The hearing was set for the following Monday. I met with Dan in a small conference room, the table buried under stacks of evidence. "We have the records of every meeting she had with the psychologist," Dan said. "We have her medical files. But they're going to attack your character. They're going to bring up the divorce, the years of silence. They're going to make you look like a gold digger who waited for her to die." I gripped the edge of the table. Let them. The truth doesn't need a PR firm. But I was worried, not for myself, but for Brianna's name. This trial would drag her secrets into the light, exposing the cracks in the empire she had worked so hard to keep perfect. It was a price I hated to pay. That Sunday night, I sat in my old apartment. I still hadn't moved into the Hillcrest house or any of the other properties. I liked the creak of the floorboards and the hum of the old refrigerator. It kept me grounded. I read her letter one more time. "I trust you because you never wanted this." I realized that was my greatest weapon. Dustin wanted it too much. He was blinded by the glow of the gold. I went to the kitchen and brewed a cup of coffee, careful not to drop the mug this time. I looked at the dark street outside, the streetlights flickering. Tomorrow, the world would decide if I was a chairman or a thief. I didn't care about the money, but I would fight for the woman who finally saw me. The courthouse was a limestone beast, its steps swarming with reporters as I arrived. Dan was by my side, his briefcase a shield against the shouted questions. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of floor wax and old paper. Dustin was already seated at the petitioner's table, looking every bit the grieving wronged heir. He didn't look at me. His lawyer, a man with a voice like gravel and a suit that cost a year's salary, opened the proceedings with a scorched earth policy. He painted a picture of a lonely aging woman whose mind had begun to slip, a woman who, in a moment of weakness, reached out to a man she hadn't seen in a decade. He called me a ghost from the past, who had haunted her final days with a calculated plan to steal her legacy. When it was our turn, Dan didn't use flowery language. He called the psychologist to the stand. One by one, they testified to Brianna's sharp intellect and her absolute certainty. They described a woman who was acutely aware of her son's limitations and deeply regretful of the path her own life had taken. The courtroom was silent as they read fragments of her evaluations. "I want to leave the world to a man who knows what it's like to work for a living," she had told one doctor. "My son only knows how to spend what others have built." I saw Dustin flinch, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. The narrative was shifting, and he could feel the ground sliding out from under him. Then came the bombshell. Dustin's lawyer called a surprise witness, Eleanor Henderson, my neighbor. My heart sank. Eleanor took the stand, her face a mask of righteous indignation. She talked about the disturbing phone calls she'd heard through the walls. She claimed she'd heard me talking about hitting the jackpot and waiting for the old girl to kick it. It was a blatant lie, likely bought and paid for by Dustin's investor friend. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Dan tried to cross-examine her, but she stuck to her story with the tenacity of a woman who finally felt important. For a moment, I saw the doubt in the judge's eyes. The $33 million felt like it was slipping through my fingers, and with it, the chance to fix the company. But then, the door at the back of the courtroom opened. A woman walked in, carrying a small weathered box. It was Brianna's old housekeeper, Maria, a woman who had worked for us when we were still married and stayed with Brianna until the very end. She hadn't been on any witness list. She walked straight to Dan and handed him the box. Inside were Brianna's private journals, the ones she'd kept hidden from everyone, even her lawyers. Dan asked for a recess to review them. When we returned, the atmosphere had changed. Dan called Maria to the stand. She talked about the nights Brianna spent crying over photos of the three of us. She talked about how Brianna had watched me from afar, driving past my apartment just to see if the lights were on. And then Dan read the final entry, dated only 2 days before she died. Dustin thinks he's ready to lead, but he's already talking to the vultures who want to strip this company bare. He doesn't love the work. He loves the status. If I leave it to him, the thousands of families who depend on this business will be out on the street within a year. Jerry is the only one who understands that a company is a community, not just a bank account. I hope he forgives me for what I'm about to do to his quiet life. The judge looked at the journal, then at Dustin, who was now staring at his hands. The lie from Eleanor Henderson withered in the face of that raw, honest prose. The jackpot story was revealed for the fabrication it was. The judge didn't take long to deliver the verdict. The will stood. The claims of undue influence were dismissed with prejudice. I remained the chairman, and the $33 million remained mine to manage. As the gavel fell, the courtroom became a whirlwind of motion. Reporters surged forward, but I only had eyes for Dustin. He was slumped in his chair, a broken man. I walked over to him. The security guards tried to stop me, but I waved them off. "Dustin," I said. He didn't look up. "This isn't about winning," I told him quietly. "You still have the house. You still have the $500,000. You can still have a father if you want one. But you have to stop looking at the money and start looking at the people you've hurt." He didn't answer. He got up and walked out the side door, his head down. I stood in the empty courtroom with Dan and Maria. "Thank you," I said to her. She smiled, a sad, knowing look. She loved you, Mr. Flores. She just didn't know how to say it while she was still breathing. I realized then that the biggest inheritance wasn't the bank account. It was the truth. I walked out of the courthouse and into the bright Wyoming sun. The gauntlet of cameras was still there, but I didn't hide. I looked straight into the lenses. "I have a company to run," I told them, "and we're going to start by making sure every employee gets a raise." I went back to the office, but I didn't go to the chairman's suite. I went to the break room and sat with the janitors and the clerks. We talked about their families, their struggles, and their hopes. I was Jerry Flores again, but with the power to change things. I knew the road ahead would be hard. Dustin wouldn't disappear, and the board would still fight me. But I had Brianna's journal in my pocket and a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in decades. I looked out the window at the city I had lived in my whole life, seeing it with new eyes. The power plant worker was now the man holding the light. I took a sip of lukewarm coffee and smiled. The real work was just beginning. I spent the evening drafting a new corporate charter, one that focused on long-term stability rather than short-term greed. I knew it would make me enemies in the high-rise offices downtown, but I didn't care. I was 65, and I had nothing left to fear. I thought about the diner, the apple pie, and the woman in the red coat. She had given me a second chance to be the man she fell in love with. I wouldn't waste it. I locked my office door and walked out into the cool night air, the stars over Wyoming bright and endless. As I reached my car, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "This isn't over." I knew it was Dustin. I sighed, looking at the dark mountains. "No," I thought. "It's just the first chapter." The board of directors met me with the warmth of a morgue slab the following Monday. I walked into the room wearing my old work boots and a denim shirt, a sharp contrast to the sea of $1,000 wool. Marcus, the CFO, had a stack of folders ready to use as weapons. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Mr. Flores, the rumors of your restructuring are bleeding the stock price," he said, sliding a printout across the mahogany. "We have 3 major investors threatening to pull out if you move forward with the wage hike." I didn't look at the paper. I looked at him. "Then let them pull out," I said, my voice steady. "We are sitting on $34 million in liquid assets and a company that makes more in a week than most towns see in a decade. We can afford to be human." The room erupted. Voices clashed like gears in a failing turbine. They talked about market share, optimization, and fiduciary duty. I waited until the noise died down to a low hum of resentment. "You're worried about the shareholders," I said, leaning forward. "I'm worried about the guy in the shipping department who can't afford his insulin. If this company can't survive while paying a living wage, then it doesn't deserve to exist." Marcus slammed his pen down. "This isn't a charity, Jerry, it's a business." I stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. "Brianna knew that," I said, and she gave the keys to the man who knows the difference. Meeting adjourned. I retreated to my office, but the peace was short-lived. A notification chimed on my computer, a legal alert from Dan Morrison. Dustin hadn't just filed a suit, he had gone to the press. A local news site featured a headline that made my stomach turn. "The thief in the chairman's chair. Son claims working-class father coerced dying mogul." Underneath was a photo of Dustin looking somber outside the Hillcrest house. He was painting me as a predator, a man who used our old marriage as a weapon to bypass his rightful inheritance. The public rung of the ladder had been reached. The social pressure was mounting, and it was starting to affect the office staff. I walked through the cubicles and saw people whispering, their eyes darting away when I looked. They didn't see the man trying to give them raises. They saw the man from the headline. I felt a wave of isolation that was colder than any Wyoming winter. I ducked into the break room for a moment of quiet, but I found someone already there. It was a young man named Leo, a junior analyst. He was staring at the news on his phone. "Is it true, Mr. Flores?" he asked, his voice hesitant. "Did you really not speak to her for 15 years? I looked at him, seeing the doubt. "Yes," I said. But the silence wasn't a plan, Leo. It was a tragedy. I left before he could ask anything else. That evening, I found a brick through my apartment window. Shards of glass lay scattered over the same linoleum where I'd dropped my coffee 3 weeks ago. I picked up the brick. A note was taped to it in jagged, angry print. "Give it back to your son." I stood in the dark, the cold wind whistling through the hole in the glass. My pulse spiked, not with fear, but with a sudden, sharp clarity. Dustin wasn't just fighting for money. He was trying to destroy my life so I'd have no choice but to retreat. He wanted me back in my pathetic little life. I didn't call the police. I called Dan. "We're moving to the next stage," I said. "Open the private archives." The private archives were kept in a high-security vault downtown, a room that smelled of ozone and old paper. Dan and I spent the night going through Brianna's most sensitive records. We weren't looking for her secrets. We were looking for Dustin's. Brianna was methodical. She had kept a dossier on her own son, tracking his business expenses for the last 5 years. What we found was a map of entitlement. Dustin had been funneling money from a subsidiary company into a failed real estate venture in Denver, hundreds of thousands of dollars hidden through offshore shells. He hadn't been earning his place, he had been looting it. I felt a sickening thud in my chest. He wasn't just greedy, he was desperate. This was why he needed the $33 million, to cover the hole he'd dug before the board noticed. My son was a thief. I sat on a cold metal stool, the bank printouts trembling in my hand. Dan looked at me, his eyes full of professional sympathy. "We can use this, Jerry. This ends the lawsuit instantly. It's criminal fraud." I stared at the records. If I used this, Dustin would go to prison. I'd win the company, but I'd lose the last fragment of my family. The choice felt like a physical weight, pressing me down into the concrete floor. I thought about the scholarship fund, the raises, and the families depending on me. Then, I thought about the toddler who used to fall asleep on my chest while I watched old movies. I closed my eyes, hearing Brianna's voice from the letter. "Learn to forgive your father for the crime of being human." Maybe she wasn't just talking to Dustin. Maybe she was talking to me. I stood up and straightened my back. "I'm not going to the police," I said. "I'm going to him." One last time. I drove to the Hillcrest house at midnight. The mountain air was sharp, smelling of pine and impending snow. Dustin opened the door, his eyes bloodshot, the house behind him dark and smelling of stale scotch. "Come to surrender?" he sneered, but his voice lacked the old bite. I walked past him and threw the dossier onto the glass coffee table. The sound was like a gunshot. He looked at the folders, and for a heartbeat, I saw the exact moment his world ended. His face went from arrogant to terrified in the span of a breath. How long have you had these?" he whispered. "Long enough," I said. "Your mother knew, Dustin. She was protecting you even in her will. She didn't disinherit you to be cruel. She did it because she knew if you had more money, you'd just dig the hole deeper." He sank onto the leather sofa, his head in his hands. "I'm ruined," he moaned. I looked at the 3-bathroom house and the mountain view. "You're not ruined," I said. "You're just finally at the bottom. I'm going to cover the Denver losses from my personal accounts. The company stays whole. But you're leaving Rock Springs. No more Hillcrest, no more suits." He looked up, tears finally breaking through. "Why? After everything I said to you?" "Because I'm your father," I said, "and because she loved you." I walked to the door, not waiting for a thank you that wouldn't mean anything yet. The snow had started to fall, tiny white flecks dancing in the porch light. My plan clicked into place like a loaded magazine. The lawsuit would be dropped by morning. The company was safe. But the cost was written in the silence of the mountain night. The fallout was swift and quiet. The news cycle moved on to a new scandal, and the brick throwers vanished into the shadows. Dustin signed over the Hillcrest house and the $500,000 to repay the subsidiary. He left town on a Tuesday morning with 2 suitcases and a look of stunned sobriety. I stood at the office window and watched his car pull out of the lot. I felt a hollow victory, a bittersweet ache that no amount of money could soothe. But the office felt different. The whispering had stopped. The staff saw the Denver repayment as an act of mercy, not a payout. I called a general meeting in the lobby. Hundreds of employees gathered, their faces expectant. I didn't stand on a stage. I stood on the floor with them. "We've had a difficult month," I said, my voice carrying without a microphone. "But the foundation is solid. Effective immediately, the wage hike is permanent, and we're opening an on-site childcare center for the night shift." The applause wasn't loud. It was deep. It was the sound of people who finally felt seen. Marcus stood in the back, his arms crossed, but he didn't protest. He knew the tide had turned. But the board had one final play. The minority shareholder who had been feeding Dustin information, a man named Sterling, called for an emergency vote. He claimed my spending was a breach of contract and that I was unfit to lead. The confrontation was set for Friday afternoon. I met with Dan one last time. "He's going to use the Denver repayment against you," Dan warned. "He'll say you used company interest to bail out a family member." I nodded. "Let him try. I have something he doesn't expect." The boardroom felt smaller this time. Sterling was a man with a face like a hawk and a voice that sounded like gravel in a blender. "You've been playing Robin Hood with our assets, Flores," he snapped. "You're out." I didn't say a word. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the business card Brianna had left in the diner in 1987. It was yellowed and frayed at the edges. I slid it across the table. "What is this?" Sterling demanded. "It's the reason this company exists," I said. "It's a reminder that we hire based on qualifications, not assumptions." I then revealed my move. I had spent the week buying up the remaining minority shares from the smaller investors who were tired of the drama. I didn't own 65% anymore. I owned 80. Sterling's face went white. "You can't. The bank wouldn't." "The bank did," I said, "because they trust a man who pays his debts. You're fired, Sterling, and I'm buying your shares at market value." The room went thinner than air. I watched him gather his things, the hawk-like arrogance replaced by a hollow defeat. Justice finally had an address. The final part of the journey didn't end in a boardroom or a courtroom. It ended back at Murphy's Diner. I went there on a Tuesday evening, the same day of the week Brianna had passed. The place hadn't changed much, the same fluorescent lights, the same smell of grease and coffee. I sat at the counter and ordered a piece of apple pie. The manager was a new man, younger, but he had the same tired look in his eyes. I ate slowly, savoring the simple sweetness. I wasn't the power plant millionaire here. I was just a man with a memory. I thought about the $33 million. Most of it was already pledged to the community trust. I was keeping enough to live comfortably, but the rest belonged to the people Brianna had forgotten in her climb. I had transitioned the company to an employee-owned model. It would take years to finalize, but the foundation was poured. I had done what she asked. I had used the wealth as a tool, not a weapon. I felt a quiet sense of peace, a weight lifting off my shoulders that had been there since 2010. My phone buzzed, a text from Dustin. "I'm working in a warehouse in Omaha. It's hard, but I'm sleeping better." I didn't cry, but I felt my throat tighten. He was finally learning to build something himself. Maybe one day we'd sit at this counter together, not as heirs or rivals, but as father and son. I sent him a simple reply. "I'm proud of you." I paid my bill and left a $5 tip next to the plate, just like I had 40 years ago. I walked out into the cool Wyoming night. The stars were big and bright, watching over the high plains. I looked toward the hill where Riverside Memorial sat, whispering a silent thank you to the woman in the red coat. She had seen the man I was even when I couldn't see him myself. Justice wasn't about the balance in the bank. It was about the balance in the heart. I climbed into my old Honda, the engine turning over with a familiar, steady hum. I didn't need a chauffeur or a limousine. I had everything I needed right here. As I drove home, I saw the lights of the power plant flickering in the distance. They were bright and steady, keeping the world running while the town slept. I smiled, my hands firm on the steering wheel. The coffee stains were gone, the lawsuits were over, and the promises were finally kept. I turned onto my street, seeing my apartment window, now repaired and glowing with a warm, soft light. I pulled into my spot, exhaled a long breath of victory, and walked toward the door. For the first time in my life, I knew exactly who I was and where I belonged. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.